Let the world outside go quiet for a moment. Whatever is waiting for you tomorrow, whatever is pressing against the edges of your mind tonight, set it down for now. There is a story that needs telling, a story about a family, a father who loved his children more than his empire, a mother who would have burned the world down to save her son, four daughters who grew up inside a palace and never really saw the world beyond its walls, and a boy who was born to inherit everything and who carried in his blood a secret that would help destroy it all. This is the story of the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia. 300 years of dynasty ending in a basement in the Ural Mountains on a summer night in 1918. But we are not starting there. We are starting at the beginning, because the end only makes sense if you understand who these people were before history caught up with them. Settle in, let the story begin. It is the spring of 1868 in the city of St. Petersburg, Russia. The city is one of the most beautiful places on earth, built on a swamp at the edge of the Gulf of Finland by an emperor who wanted to drag his country into the modern world by sheer force of will. Peter the Great built St. Petersburg over the bodies of the workers who died constructing it, and he named it after himself, and for 2 centuries it had been the heart of the Russian Empire. Grand palaces lined the banks of the Neva River. Canals cut through the city like silver threads. The Winter Palace, home of the Romanov dynasty, stretched along the embankment in a sweep of green and white and gold that seemed designed to remind everyone who saw it that the people who lived there were not quite the same species as everyone else. On May 6th of that year, in a palace in the town of Tsarskoye Selo just outside the city, a boy was born to the imperial family. His name was Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov. He was the eldest son of the future Tsar Alexander III and his wife Maria Fedorovna, a Danish princess who had come to Russia and made herself thoroughly at home in it. Alexander was a giant of a man, barrel-chested and physically enormous, with a personality to match his body. He believed in the absolute authority of the Tsar. He believed in Russia. He believed that the way to govern a vast and complicated empire was with a firm hand and no concessions to anyone who thought otherwise. His son Nicholas was nothing like him. Where Alexander was large, Nicholas was slight. Where Alexander was decisive and certain, Nicholas was gentle and hesitant. He had his mother's sensitivity and his father's sense of duty, but almost none of his father's iron certainty about what he wanted and how to get it. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely sweet person, warm to the people around him, devoted to his family, fond of outdoor exercise and quiet evenings, and the simple pleasures of a life that his position made almost impossible to live. He once wrote in his diary, "I am not prepared to be a czar. I never wanted to become one." He was 17 when he wrote that. He had no idea how prophetic it would turn out to be. Nicholas grew up inside the extraordinary bubble of the Russian imperial court. It was a world of almost incomprehensible luxury. The Winter Palace had over 1,000 rooms. The family moved between palaces the way ordinary people move between rooms. Tsarskoye Selo, the country estate south of St. Petersburg, had parks and lakes and a small railway built just for the imperial family. The Levadia Palace in Crimea was where they went to escape the northern winters. There were yachts on the Black Sea and hunting lodges in the forests of Poland, and a private train that moved the family across the empire in carriages upholstered in silk. Around all of this, behind all of this, was Russia itself. And Russia in the late 19th century was a country in profound and gathering tension. The vast majority of the population were peasants, people living in conditions that had barely changed in centuries, farming small strips of land, living in wooden houses, existing at the edge of subsistence, entirely dependent on the weather and the harvest for everything. Below the peasants in terms of legal rights were the workers flooding into the industrial cities, living in crowded tenements, working in factories for wages that barely kept them alive, in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Between that Russia and the Russia of the Winter Palace, A distance existed that was not measured in miles but in centuries. The Tsar and his family lived in a world so removed from the lives of ordinary Russians that they might as well have been inhabitants of a different planet. Nicholas grew up understanding, in an abstract way, that he would one day be responsible for all of it. But the palaces and the yacht and the private train made it very difficult to feel the reality of what that responsibility meant. And his father, Alexander III, made it worse. He was so certain that he knew how to govern Russia that he never really taught Nicholas how to do it. The crown prince was educated in languages and history and military matters. But in the actual business of ruling a crumbling empire, Alexander considered himself so supremely competent that he never imagined he might die before he had time to pass on what he knew. Alexander II died in 1894 at the age of 49. Nicholas was 26 years old, and suddenly he was the Tsar of all the Russias. A few weeks before his father died, Nicholas had become engaged. Her name was Alex, Princess Alex of Hesse, a small German duchy, granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. She was 22 years old, with reddish hair and gray eyes, and a manner that most of the Russian court found cold and distant. She was actually intensely shy. The shyness read as arrogance to people who didn't know her, and in Russia, where the Tsarina was expected to be warm and charming and present at an endless round of social engagements, her shyness would cost her enormously. Nicholas had been in love with her for years. They had met when she was 12 and he was 16, and he had written in his diary that he dreamed of marrying her. Through all the years of courtship, through all the obstacles that had been placed in the way of the match, he had never wavered. He loved her with a completeness and a steadiness that was, in the context of royal marriages of the era, almost remarkable. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Fedorovna. They were married in 1894, less than a week after Alexander III was buried. The honeymoon, such as it was, happened while the court was still in mourning. It was not the beginning Nicholas or Alexandra had imagined, but it set a tone for what was to come. Their personal happiness and the demands of the empire would always be in tension. The empire would usually win, and the cost of that would come due, slowly and then all at once over the next 24 years. The coronation of Nicholas II took place in Moscow in May 1896. It was a ceremony of almost medieval splendor. Nicholas wore robes encrusted with diamonds. Alexandra was crowned beside him. The churches of the Kremlin rang with bells. The streets were lined with tens of thousands of people who had come from across the empire to see their new Tsar. And then, on the Kadinka field outside the city, where a public celebration had been organized for the common people, something went terribly wrong. Word had spread that gifts were being distributed. Hundreds of thousands of people crowded onto the field, pushing toward the distribution points. The crowd surged. People fell. The crowd kept moving because those at the back could not see what was happening at the front. By the time it was over, more than 1,000 people were dead, trampled, suffocated in the crush. Nicholas and Alexandra were told of the disaster. And then, on the advice of his ministers who argued that canceling the festivities would send the wrong message, Nicholas went to a ball that evening. He was not a cold man. He was not indifferent. He was a man who had been raised to defer to his advisors, who had not yet found his footing as emperor, who genuinely did not understand the signal that his attendance at that ball would send to the people of Russia. But the people of Russia saw it differently. They saw a Tsar who knew that hundreds of his subjects had just died, and who danced anyway. It was the first impression Nicholas II made on his own people as their emperor. It would be a long time before he got another chance. In the years that followed, Nicholas and Alexandra built a life that was, inside its extraordinary shell, genuinely ordinary in its happiness. They had children, 4 daughters, one after another, each one beautiful and distinct in her personality. Olga came first in 1895. She was bright and serious, with her father's blue eyes and something of his gentleness. She read everything she could find. She thought carefully before she spoke. She was the daughter who most resembled Nicholas in temperament, and Nicholas adored her for it. Tatiana came next in 1897. She was perhaps the most beautiful of the four, with dark hair and a natural authority that made her the organizer among the sisters, the one who made decisions, the one the others looked to. She was closest to her mother of all the children. Alexandra depended on her. Maria arrived in 1899. She was warm and round-faced and straightforwardly sweet, without Olga's intellectualism or Tatiana's sharp edges. She was the one who wanted to talk to everyone, to know people's names and their stories, to connect. The servants loved Maria more openly than they could safely love the others. And then Anastasia in 1901. The youngest daughter was a force of nature. Funny, mischievous, restless, endlessly inventive in her schemes and her teasing. She was the one who could make the whole family laugh. She was the one who climbed things she shouldn't climb and said things she probably shouldn't say and got away with it because she was Anastasia, and even the people she exasperated found it impossible to stay exasperated with her for long. The family called the older two the big pair, and the younger two the little pair, and the four of them formed a world of their own, inside the already enclosed world of the imperial family. They needed that world, because they were, despite all appearances, profoundly isolated. Nicholas and Alexandra's sense of security around strangers meant the children grew up with very few friends their own age. They had each other and their parents, and the servants who had been with the family for years, and that was almost all. They were among the most famous children in the world, and among the loneliest. Alexandra wanted a son. Not for herself, for Russia, for the dynasty. A Tsar needed a male heir. That was simply the reality of the world she had married into. 4 daughters were loved and cherished. But the Russian succession required a son. Without one, the throne would eventually pass to Nicholas's brother, and then to increasingly distant relatives, and the direct Romanov line would end. Alexandra consulted mystics. She prayed with an intensity that crossed into desperation. She made pilgrimages and followed recommendations from holy men and holy women that Nicholas watched with a mixture of love and quiet concern. And in 1904, she gave birth to a son. They named him Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov. He was the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne of Russia. He was the answer to everything Alexandra had hoped for. And within weeks of his birth, they knew something was wrong. Hemophilia is a disease that prevents blood from clotting normally. A small cut that would heal on its own for most people becomes, for a hemophiliac, a prolonged and dangerous bleed. Internal bleeding, caused by a bruise or a bump, can pool in joints and muscles and cause agonizing pain and permanent damage. A bleed into the wrong place can be fatal. Queen Victoria of England had carried the gene. It had passed through her daughters into several of the royal families of Europe. Alexandra was a carrier, though she did not know this before Alexei was born. The Romanovs kept Alexei's condition a secret from the Russian people. The heir to the throne, the future Tsar, could not be seen as weak or damaged. The secret was necessary. But the secret also meant that Nicholas and Alexandra lived with a terror they could share with almost no one. Every time Alexei fell, every time he bumped a knee or bruised an arm, every time the internal bleeding began and the doctors stood helpless because there was nothing in 1904 medicine that could reliably stop it. Every time the boy they loved more than anything in the world lay screaming in pain that no one could reach. Alexandra, who was already prone to anxiety, became consumed by it. She had brought this into her son's blood. She knew it. She carried that knowledge with her every day. It shaped everything she did and thought and decided for the rest of her life. And into this atmosphere of fear and desperation and love and helplessness, in 1905, came Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian peasant who had found God in his own particular and startling way. He was not a priest. He had no formal religious education. He was a large, rough-edged man with dark eyes that people who met him consistently described as extraordinary, penetrating, impossible to look away from. He had wandered through Russia on religious pilgrimages and somehow accumulated a reputation as a holy man, a faith healer, a man through whom God moved in ways that defied ordinary explanation. He arrived in St. Petersburg in the middle of the social upheaval that was beginning to shake the empire. The 1905 revolution had been suppressed, but not forgotten. The intelligentsia and the aristocracy were both fascinated by the mystical and the spiritual in ways that were partly genuine and partly fashion. Rasputin fit into this world perfectly, and also not at all. He was too raw, too strange, too peasant for the polished salons of the capital. And that strangeness was part of what made him compelling. A lady-in-waiting introduced him to Alexandra. The introduction was made because of Alexei, because the boy was suffering, because the doctors had tried everything they knew and nothing worked, because a mother in desperation will try anything. Rasputin prayed at the boy's bedside, and Alexei improved. Whether it was genuine healing or coincidence, or the fact that Rasputin's calming presence reduced the boy's fear, and therefore his physical tension, which could affect bleeding, nobody can say for certain. What is certain is that Alexandra believed. She believed completely, with the same totality with which she believed everything she chose to believe. Rasputin was the instrument of God's mercy toward her son. That was the beginning and the end of it. From that point forward, her faith in him was essentially unshakable. And Nicholas, who was more skeptical but who loved his wife, and could see what Alexei's suffering did to her, allowed Rasputin his place in the palace. It was politically a catastrophe in slow motion. While Rasputin moved through the corridors of the Winter Palace, Russia was moving toward a crisis that had been building for decades. The 1905 revolution had been suppressed, but it had also forced Nicholas to make concessions he didn't fully believe in. A Duma, a representative assembly, had been created. Reforms had been promised. Then Nicholas had pulled back from those promises, dissolving Duma that opposed him, ruling by decree when Parliament wouldn't cooperate, trying to hold a line that was shifting under his feet. He was not a tyrant in the ordinary sense of the word. He was not cruel or arbitrary or sadistic. He was a man who genuinely believed that Russia needed the firm hand of autocracy, that the Russian people were not ready for the kind of constitutional government that was spreading across Europe, that his role was to hold the line until Russia was ready for something different. He may have been right that Russia was not ready. He was wrong that holding the line indefinitely was possible. And then, in the summer of 1914, something happened in a city called Sarajevo that made everything else irrelevant. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary on June 28, 1914, set in motion the machinery of alliances and ultimatums and mobilizations that produced the First World War. Russia was pulled into it almost inevitably. Austria-Hungary threatened Serbia. Russia was Serbia's ally. Germany was Austria-Hungary's ally. France was Russia's ally. Britain was pulled in by Germany's invasion of Belgium. Within weeks, most of Europe was at war. Nicholas made the decision to mobilize. He agonized over it, according to the accounts of those around him. He sent telegrams to his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, whom he called Willie, trying to find a way back from the brink. But the machinery was moving faster than any individual could stop it. Russia entered the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary in August 1914. And from that point forward, everything moved toward disaster with the slow, inexorable weight of an avalanche. The Russian army was enormous. It was also, in many ways, not ready. Russia's industrial capacity was far below Germany's. Its railway network was inadequate for the demands of modern war. Its supply lines were a persistent problem. Officers were often poorly trained. Communication between units broke down regularly. The weapons and ammunition available to Russian soldiers were frequently insufficient. In the first year of the war, Russia suffered catastrophic losses. Millions of soldiers killed or wounded or taken prisoner. Entire armies destroyed. The thinkers, the educated men, the officers whose experience would have been irreplaceable, dying in the mud of the Eastern Front. At home, the war's demands were felt immediately. Food became scarce in the cities as the railways prioritized military supply. Prices rose. The lines outside bakeries grew longer. The patience of a population that had already been stretched thin by years of poverty and political tension began to give way. Nicholas, in 1915, made a decision that seemed to him like duty and seemed to his ministers like madness. He went to the front to personally take command of the Russian armies. The decision was catastrophic in its implications, because it meant that every defeat, every reversal, every disaster suffered by the Russian army was now personally associated with the Tsar. Nicholas's name was attached to the losses. His authority absorbed the failures. Each time the army retreated or was broken, it was the Tsar who had failed. And while he was at the front, Alexandra was in St. Petersburg. And Rasputin was with Alexandra. The war years in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd to sound less German at the start of the war, were strange and dark. Alexandra ran the home front with genuine effort and genuine devotion. She turned the palaces into hospitals. She trained as a nurse and worked in the wards, changing dressings and sitting with dying men. Tatiana and Olga worked beside her. It was, in the context of their privileged lives, genuine service. But the political damage was happening simultaneously, in the salons and the government offices and the Duma chamber. Rasputin had, by this point, become the focal point of every fear and resentment that the Russian aristocracy and middle class held about the imperial family. He met with ministers and interfered in appointments. He advised Alexandra, who conveyed his recommendations to Nicholas at the front. The rumor spread, almost certainly false but impossible to kill, that he and Alexandra were lovers. The rumor spread that he was a German agent, working to weaken Russia from within. None of this was true, but truth is not what shapes political reality. Perception is. And the perception was of a German-born empress under the influence of a Siberian peasant mystic, making decisions that affected the course of the war, while the Tsar sat at the front and the army bled. The aristocracy began to whisper among themselves. Something had to be done. In December 1916, a group of nobles led by a prince named Felix Yusupov invited Rasputin to a party. They served him cakes and wine laced with cyanide. Rasputin ate and drank. The poison seemed to have no effect. Felix shot him. Rasputin apparently got up. He was shot again. He was beaten. He was thrown into a frozen river. When they pulled his body out, his lungs contained water. He had been alive when he went into the Neva. The story of Rasputin's death became as strange and mythologized as his life. The details have been questioned by historians, but what is certain is that in December 1916, Rasputin died, and his death did nothing to save the Romanovs. It was too late for that. The revolution was already coming. February 1917. Winter in Petrograd. The temperature well below freezing. The city running short of bread. Women who had stood in line for hours outside bakeries returning home empty-handed. Workers in the factories putting down their tools and walking out. The protests began on International Women's Day, March 8th by the modern calendar. Women in the factory districts marched through the streets demanding bread. The next day, more workers joined them. The day after that, the strikes were general. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of the capital. Nicholas, at the front, ordered the commander of the Petrograd garrison to restore order. The soldiers were sent to disperse the crowds. And the soldiers refused. Not all of them, but enough. Enough soldiers looked at the crowds in the streets, at the women demanding bread, at the workers who had simply had enough, and decided that they were not going to shoot them. Some soldiers joined the protesters. The garrison, which was supposed to be the last line of defense of the autocracy, dissolved. Nicholas received a telegram telling him what was happening. He dissolved the Duma. It was the move of a man who had run out of other ideas. The Duma refused to dissolve. Its leaders sent Nicholas a message saying that the situation was beyond repair, that the only option was abdication. Nicholas refused at first. He got on his train and tried to return to Petrograd. The railway workers switched the tracks. The train was diverted. He was stranded, cut off from his capital, the machinery of the empire seizing up around him. His generals, one by one, telegraphed him with the same advice. Abdicate. It is the only way to save Russia and the dynasty. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signed the document of abdication. He abdicated for himself and, in a decision that stunned everyone, for his son Alexei as well. He could not bear the thought of Alexei being taken from him, of his sick boy being delivered into the hands of strangers who would be his regents. He passed the throne to his brother Michael. Michael declined it within 24 hours. And just like that, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was over. Nicholas wrote in his diary that night, "All around me is treason, cowardice, and deceit." He was not wrong about any of those things, but he was also, though he could not see it, describing the world his own failures had helped create. After the abdication, the family was placed under house arrest at the Alexandra Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. The provisional government that had replaced the Tsar was uncertain what to do with them. There was talk of sending them to England. King George V, Nicholas's cousin, initially agreed to offer them asylum. Then he withdrew the offer, afraid of the political consequences of sheltering the deposed Tsar during wartime. The withdrawal came too late for George to feel proud of it for the rest of his life. So the family stayed. And in those first months, the life they lived inside the Alexandra Palace was strange in its mixture of the familiar and the drastically changed. Nicholas dug the kitchen garden. He sawed wood. He read aloud to his children in the evenings. Alexandra sat with Alexei, who was ill again, whose hemophilia had been made worse by the stress and the changed circumstances. The four girls moved around each other in the closed space, adapting in different ways, finding different ways to fill the endless hours. They were still together. That was what mattered to all of them. In the summer of 1917, the provisional government, now under pressure from its own left flank, decided to move the family further from the capital, further from their supporters, further from any possibility of rescue. They were sent to Tobolsk in Siberia. Tobolsk, a small town in western Siberia on the river Irtysh, not a place of punishment exactly, not a prison in the formal sense, but remote, cold, far from everything the family had known. They were housed in the former governor's mansion, a decent building, comfortable enough by the standards of their new situation. They settled into a routine. Nicholas walked the small courtyard allowed to them. He continued to read to the children. Alexandra, whose health had been declining for years, spent much of her time in her room. The four girls embroidered and read and took lessons and tried to construct something like a normal life in circumstances that were anything but. Alex had another hemophilia attack that nearly killed him. The world outside Tobolsk was changing rapidly and catastrophically. In November 1917, the provisional government fell. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. The revolution that had begun in February was now something harder and colder and more absolute. The civil war that followed was devastating. The Red Army fighting for the Bolsheviks against the White Army fighting for the old order. Armies moving across the vast landscape of Russia. Cities changing hands. massacres and reprisals and atrocities on both sides. The Romanovs, in their house in Tobolsk, heard about all of it through rumor and fragments of news. They understood that the world they had known was being destroyed. They understood that their situation was becoming more dangerous. They did not know how to understand what that danger meant or where it was leading. In the spring of 1918, they were moved again to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. The house in Yekaterinburg belonged to a merchant named Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks had renamed it the House of Special Purpose. It was surrounded by a high wooden fence that blocked all view of the outside. The windows were painted over with whitewash so the family could not see out and no one could see in. Guards were stationed everywhere. The conditions were harder than anything they had experienced before. Nicholas was 50, Alexandra was 46, Olga was 22, Tatiana was 21, Maria was 19, Anastasia was 17. Alexei was 13, unable to walk because of the damage his hemophilia had done to his joints. The family had with them a small group of loyal servants who had refused to leave them, a doctor named Botkin who had chosen to stay when he could have gone, a cook, a housemaid, a footman. They had been together through everything. They were still together. In the Ipatiev house, the days passed in a strange, compressed tension. Nicholas gardened in the small courtyard when allowed. He read. He played cards with the children. Alexandra read the Bible. Alexei, unable to walk, was brought downstairs in a wheelchair or carried by his father. Nicholas carried his son everywhere in those last months. He carried him upstairs and downstairs. He carried him from his bed to the garden. He carried him the way a father carries a child who is too sick to walk, which is with a kind of fierce and tender protectiveness that asks nothing and expects nothing and simply does what love requires. Outside the walls of the Ipatiev house, the White Army was advancing toward Yekaterinburg. The Bolshevik commanders in the city received instructions from Moscow. There was to be no rescue. There was to be no trial. There was to be no possibility of the former Tsar becoming a rallying point for the enemies of the revolution. The decision was made. The night of July 16, 1918. The family had gone to bed. It was past midnight when they were woken. The guards told them to dress and come downstairs. There was unrest in the city, they said. It was safer in the basement. They should bring what they needed for the night. Nicholas carried Alexei downstairs. They were brought to a small room in the basement. The room was low-ceilinged and had a single arched window painted over. There was nothing in it. Nicholas asked for chairs. 3 chairs were brought. He and Alexandra sat. Alexei, who could not stand, sat between them. The girls stood against the wall. The servants stood with them. The local Bolshevik commander, a man named Yekaterinburg, came into the room. He read from a paper. He said that in view of the advance of the White Army and the counter-revolutionary movement, the Ural Soviet had decided to execute Nicholas Romanov and his family. Nicholas said, "What?" And then the shooting began. It was not quick. The jewels that Alexandra and the girls had sewn into their corsets, trying to hide the family's remaining valuables, deflected some of the bullets. The smoke in the small room was so thick that the shooters could barely see. The screaming. It lasted more than 20 minutes. Afterward, the bodies were taken to a forest outside the city. They were buried in a pit. Lye was poured over them to destroy the evidence. 2 of the bodies, Alexei and one of his sisters, were burned separately and buried in a different place nearby. For 73 years, the world did not know exactly where they were. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a grave was found in the forest outside Yekaterinburg. DNA testing confirmed the identities: Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and the servants who had stayed. In 2007, a second grave was found nearby. The burned remains of 2 people. DNA testing confirmed that they were Alexei and one of his sisters, almost certainly Anastasia or Maria. The family was together in the end, as they had been in the beginning, as they had insisted on being through everything in between. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the remains of Nicholas and Alexandra and 3 of their daughters were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of the Romanov Tsars. The ceremony was held in July, in summer, in a city that glittered with white nights. Thousands of people attended. There were prayers in the old Orthodox manner, incense and candlelight and the ancient words. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family in the year 2000. They are now saints in the Russian Church, passion bearers in the Orthodox tradition, those who met their deaths with Christian acceptance and without resistance. Whether or not you believe in saints, there is something in that designation that captures something real about them. They did not resist. Nicholas, who had the choice to abdicate and did, who had the choice to rage against what was happening and largely chose not to, who carried his son down the stairs in the middle of the night because someone told him it was safer, without knowing it was the last thing he would ever do for Alexei. Alexandra, who prayed until the end. The girls, who were 22 and 21 and 19 and 17, and who had done nothing except be born into a family that history decided to make an example of. Alexei was 13. What do we say about the Romanovs? Nicholas II was, by almost any measure, a failure as a ruler. He was indecisive when decisiveness was needed. He was stubborn when flexibility was needed. He was incapable of the kind of political imagination that might have found a way to bring Russia through the crisis of the early 20th century without the revolution that destroyed everything. He believed in things that were no longer believable. He held on to a world that was already gone. He also loved his wife with complete fidelity for 24 years. He was a devoted and tender father to 5 children. He was, in his personal life, a decent and gentle man who was catastrophically unsuited to the position history had placed him in. Alexandra believed in things that could not be true, needed things that could not be provided, and made decisions that contributed to the erosion of the monarchy's credibility at the moment it needed credibility most. She was also a woman who sewed the last of her jewels into her children's corsets in a basement in Yekaterinburg, trying to the last to protect them. Olga read books and thought carefully, and died at 22. Tatiana organized and managed, and was the responsible one, and died at 21. Maria wanted to know everyone, and loved everyone easily, and died at 19. Anastasia made everyone laugh and climbed things she shouldn't, and said things she probably shouldn't, and died at 17. Alexei was carried down a staircase by his father in the middle of a summer night, and died at 13. The Romanov story has been told many times, in books and films and documentaries and exhibitions. It has been romanticized and mythologized, particularly around Anastasia, the legend of whose survival persisted for decades because people found the alternative too terrible to accept. The alternative is what happened. The family was killed, all of them, in a small basement room in a city in the Ural Mountains in the middle of the summer of 1918 by men who had been given orders and carried them out. There is nothing romantic about it. But there is something about this family that keeps pulling people back, even knowing the ending, even knowing exactly how it ends. You go back because of the children, because of Alexei being carried down the stairs, because of Anastasia, who was 17 and funny and alive until she wasn't, because of Nicholas, who wrote in his diary that he was not prepared to be a czar and was not wrong, and who tried anyway, and who failed, and who in the end could not even protect the people he loved most. The dynasty lasted 300 years. The family lasted until a summer night in Yekaterinburg. The story has lasted longer than either. It is late now, wherever you are. The story is finished. Somewhere in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, in the city that was built on a swamp and named after an emperor and renamed and named again. The last Tsar and his wife lie in the same crypt as the great Tsars who came before them. Peter the Great is there. Catherine the Great is there. And Nicholas II is there at the end of the line. Outside the cathedral, the Neva River moves the way it has always moved, through the city of bridges and canals, past the green and white and gold of the Winter Palace, where once a family lived in rooms lit by 1,000 candles, and tried to understand a country that was always larger and harder and more complicated than any one family could contain. The river keeps moving. The story is over. Sleep well.